This is My Randomology, and class is in session. Welcome to the very first My Randomology lecture. Now, this is going to be a series that's going to go on every single week for as long as I can manage it. So first on the agenda, what exactly is science fiction? Because a lot of the stuff on this channel, in My Randomology over on Facebook, just in general, seems to revolve around science fiction. What exactly is it? Because it seems like it's everywhere. Superhero movies, action movies, entire franchises just going back decades. And it's not just here in the US, this is international. There are franchises in other countries you've probably never even heard of. This thing has been around everywhere. So it probably helps to try to figure out what exactly is science fiction. But to do that, first we need to understand the importance of genre. Now, it helps if you think of genre as a set of expectations between both the creator of a work and the audience. In other words, when somebody's about to go into a movie and they've seen the poster and maybe seen the trailer, they have an expectation as to what kind of genre they are about to be witness to. If you are being sold a comedy, for example, you don't want to actually watch something where everybody dies at the end. That would be a tragedy. I mean, it would actually literally be a tragedy. That's the definition. Well, it's one of the definitions of a tragedy. Genres help creators to kind of stay in a particular lane to know what an audience expects them to do.
I don't know what I expected.
Now, this is not to say that a genre is absolutely rigid. Every single genre has these little soft spots where you can kind of veer off and experiment and do different things and, you know, dismiss audience expectations and try to create something new. Of course you can. But in general, a genre kind of tells you what is expected in a very general sense. And it also helps to keep in mind that a genre can also be blended with other genres. For example, there is such a thing as a science fiction drama, a science fiction comedy, just like there is a horror comedy, a horror thriller, a supernatural horror, all these different flavors. Now, we're going to go into what exactly a genre is and the importance of a genre and how you go about mixing them in a future video. But for right now, all we need to know is that a genre is what an audience expects and what a writer is expected to do when they're putting together something in that genre. And for the purposes of this video and a bunch of other videos, we really do need to understand what is science fiction. How do we define it? What works do we put under this big umbrella of science fiction in order to study it? Well, as it turns out, that's a good question because nobody knows.
What?
Okay, well, it would be more accurate to say that there's a lot of people that have a lot of very different definitions as to what constitutes science fiction. Now, the problem is trying to figure out, is there a definition that actually encompasses all of these different theories as to what is science fiction? Now, whenever my students were going to do their movie reviews, one of the major things that I had them do is try to figure out, well, what genre is whatever movie it is that you're trying to look at. If you're going to look at a comedy, for example, you need to understand what are the expectations for a comedy, or for a Western, or for an action film, or for a fantasy film, or for a horror film.
That's just wrong.
You have to judge a work based on what it's supposed to do. And that's a little bit difficult with a science fiction work because it seems like you can blend science fiction into a lot of things, into comedy, drama, horror, fantasy even. So what exactly is it? I mean, how do you define this thing that seems to be everywhere and yet nobody can really tell you what it is?
Fucking magnets, how do they work?
I mean, the simplest answer that I've gotten from a student is, you know, when I ask them what is science fiction, they'll look at me and say, oh, it's something where there's technology that doesn't exist. But that doesn't really apply to a lot of works that are considered science fiction. I mean, really, the easiest way to start a fight between science fiction fans or even science fiction academics is to ask them to define the thing they're a fan of. weird thing is that science fiction is a bit like that old definition of pornography. I don't know what it is, but I'll know it when I see it. Like, you can look at Harry Potter and most people will probably say, no, that's not science fiction, that's fantasy. Okay, My Fair Lady, that's not science fiction. Star Trek, yeah, sure, that's science fiction. Star Wars, maybe. I mean, they have spaceships and robots and advanced technology, but they also have magic space knights.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions. Number one, how dare you?
And there are even writers who write science fiction works who don't like being called science fiction writers. One of the most famous examples is Margaret Atwood, who wrote one of the most important science fiction works, The Handmaid's Tale. She did not want to consider that a science fiction work, despite the fact that a lot of people call it science fiction. Kurt Vonnegut, too. You know, he wrote a very, very influential science fiction work, and yet most people would not call him a science fiction writer. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that science fiction is considered to be this sort of like whimsical, kind of goofy and immature genre. You know, it's the kind of thing that, you know, Star Trek, Star Wars is not considered to be a serious or literary work. So even if you write something in it and it's considered to be good, or even if it's considered to be a classic of English literature, there are a lot of writers who will not want to be addressed as science fiction writers, or even acknowledging that they wrote something in science fiction.
These are confusing times.
Maybe a good way to start talking about this is to just kind of put science fiction on the map as far as other genres are concerned. Now, there is a bigger umbrella term called speculative fiction. Now, this is sort of the big umbrella term that covers anything that's based on something that is not real. Now, this covers what most people would call or categorize as science fiction, as well as fantasy, and also includes some horror. Not all of it, just some horror. Basically, speculative fiction is anything that is based on something which is not real, something which has to be made up. And that goes beyond just like characters who are not real people. I mean, these are situations and settings which are fantastical, which are not real and cannot be real, or at least we don't think they can be real. So in the broadest sense possible, science fiction is a genre that includes things which are not real. At least not right now. Now, if we try to look at different science fiction works and try to figure out, well, what makes them science fiction, the easiest and I guess the knee-jerk reaction would be, well, it's something that has technology that is not real, something which is futuristic, technology that doesn't exist yet, or maybe can't exist. Now, that's a good start. The problem is that if we narrow it down to something like that, then by that definition, has technology which doesn't exist, then the James Bond movies and even the Fast and Furious movies are science fiction.
Nope.
And I'm willing to bet top dollar that nobody out there watching this video right now would call either of those franchises science fiction. Also, I will rip off my own legs before I call the Fast and Furious franchise science fiction. I am sorry.
Professionals have standards.
The thing is, there's a lot of science fiction out there that has either no advanced technology or technology which is just barely more advanced than what was available at the time. 1984, for example, despite being written in the 40s, has one piece of advanced technology, which are the telescreens. Now, all that is a television set with an integrated camera. That's it. Both of those pieces of technology existed when the thing was written, but that's kind of it. It's just a combination of two different things. The Handmaid's Tale also has a future society set in what is basically a post-apocalyptic dystopia, and yet there is almost nothing in that book that would be considered futuristic technology. Another problem is that a lot of people don't like to think of science fiction as something which is serious. Now, this has to do with what is it supposed to do? Now, when people think science fiction, a lot of people go to Star Wars and Star Trek, you know, the big franchises. And a lot of them will think that, well, science fiction just can't be literary or it can't be serious. Now, this is something that I'm going to address in the context of horror as well in a future video, but I think this also misses the mark. I mean, any genre, action, drama, thrillers, mysteries, they all have their pulpy, kind of mass-produced bits, and yet nobody is out there saying that action is a childish or just a pulpy genre. This only seems to affect really science fiction and horror and fantasy as well to a certain extent. So just to look at it in that respect, that it's not a serious thing, that's also not a good criteria, I think. This is actually part of the reason why Margaret Atwood did not want The Handmaid's Tale to be considered science fiction, because, or at least at the time when she said that, she didn't want to be considered to be, somebody who wrote something which was childish or not literary. She wanted to be taken seriously, and to this day, still, to say that somebody is a science fiction writer, there's a popular conception that they're not serious about their craft, or what they're writing isn't serious or shouldn't be taken seriously. And yet, go into any English department in high schools and colleges, universities all across the country, and you will see that there are science fiction works on a lot of those syllabi. The War of the Worlds, Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe, he wrote something which could be considered early science fiction as well, Jules Verne. So clearly there is merit to the genre, so it's not a question of is it serious or not. Now, we could also make the argument that science fiction is supposed to be something which tries to predict the future. It has advanced technology for its time, but what happens when we bypass the time that this thing was supposed to be set? 1984, for example. 1984, the year itself, came and went. No Big Brother, no telescreens. Is it still science fiction if it was wrong? H.G. Wells wrote about the first man on the moon. That was clearly very wrong. A lot of early science fiction talked about civilizations on the moon, on Mars, dinosaurs on Venus. We now know that that is entirely wrong. It was a very, very wrong prediction. So are they still science fiction, or would we call them fantasy? The thing with all these criteria, though, is that I think it tries to reduce science fiction as a genre to its individual elements. It's like you're trying to tick off a checklist of, does it have this? Doesn't it have that? And I think that sort of misses the forest for the trees. It's like that old parable of, the four blind men trying to describe an elephant, where one touches the side and says, oh, an elephant is a large, hard surface. And then somebody else touches the trunk and says, well, no, an elephant is kind of like a snake. And then somebody else touches a leg and is like, well, no, an elephant is kind of like a tree. I think all of these things have a piece of what makes science fiction, but we have to kind of take the totality of all these things and kind of figure out, well, where does the Venn diagram actually overlap in most of these things? Now, the good thing is that we actually have records of science fiction writers and academics just talking about what this means, and, well, we can try to kind of analyze what it is that they're trying to say, and maybe through looking at all these things, we can figure out what actually is science fiction. Now, first up, we have Darko Suvin, a Yugoslavian-born academic who once wrote, "Science fiction is a literary genre whose necessary and sufficient conditions are the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition, and whose main formal device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment." Which is a kind of complex way of saying that whatever science fiction is not the real world. It's not only not the real world, but it should be something which is interacted with in a way that causes somebody in the story to have to think about the fact that this is different. This is not something which is real. Tom Shippey, who is considered to be one of the foremost Tolkien scholars in the world, also once said, "Science fiction involves a discrete piece of information recognizable as not true, but also not unlike true, not flatly, and in the current state of knowledge, impossible." Okay, so we're starting to get a little bit of overlap here. This is something which is not real. However, we still don't have anything that really sets science fiction and fantasy apart. I mean, fantasy and science fiction, at least in this context, both still kind of mean something which isn't real. John W. Campbell Jr., who was the editor for Astounding Science Fiction for many, many years, actually gave us a little bit better of a definition, I think. To be science fiction, not fantasy, an honest effort at prophetic extrapolation from the known must be made. Okay, so science fiction has to take a guess at something that is plausible in some context with the real world. So it doesn't have to be real, but there should be some attempt at making it appear to be real either tomorrow or at some point in the future. Which actually brings us to Rod Serling's definition, which is kind of builds on this. Rod Serling said, fantasy is the impossible made probable, science fiction is the improbable made possible. Okay, now we're starting to differentiate these two. So science fiction has to be something which is presented as possible in some way. Now, whatever that means, possible, very much depends on the actual situation. Whether it's a piece of technology based on some bleeding edge science or some new science that gets invented. And what that science is also not been mentioned. And there's nothing here that says that it has to be some, feat of engineering. It could be the social sciences. And then we start getting into this thing of between hard and soft science fiction. And I already made a video on that, sort of, but we're going to touch on that later. But nevertheless, okay, so science fiction is something which is not real, but which is presented as being possible in some way. Okay. Now, Isaac Asimov, one of the greats in the genre, I think put it a little bit better and gave us a little bit more detail. Isaac Asimov said, science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. Okay, so whatever this thing is, this change, this thing that's fantastical, it has to have some kind of interaction with the characters. It can't just be a thing that's just there. It has to be central to the plot and the theme of whatever is going on. And this is the wonderful thing about this channel and the whole idea of randomology. The reason I came up with that word to describe this channel, the website itself, Facebook, the reason that I'm using that as kind of a handle is because I believe in the idea of looking at all these different things and again, kind of looking at it through the context of, the blind man looking at an elephant. All of them have a piece of it. Like, I don't think any of the people who I just quoted is wrong in their definition, but I think they all have a piece of it. I think they all have something to contribute to this larger tapestry that is science fiction. So given all of those quotes and given everything else that I've just talked about, I think that we can come up with a definition of science fiction that is inclusive of almost everything that most of us would consider to be science fiction, while also excluding things which most of us would agree are not science fiction. And again, this comes from the fact that most of us would probably say this is science fiction and this is not, but we can't really define it. So for the purposes of this video and subsequent videos, here is how I'm going to define science fiction. Science fiction is fiction that has some fantastical element which is not real. However, this element must be presented as plausible in some way based on current science or some future science which we do not know, but is plausible within the world of the story. Not only that, but this fantastical element or elements should be central to the story and drive the plot and themes in a meaningful way. Now, I guess depending on your mindset, that sounds like a either really simple or really complex answer to what is science fiction, but I think that kind of encapsulates, like I said, most works that most of us would consider to be science fiction. So what falls under this umbrella? Well, Doctor Who, Harlan Ellison, what he considered to be the greatest science fiction series of all time, that is science fiction. Even though there are things in that franchise which appear to be magical, they are presented as though they are based on some kind of scientific principle, even if the characters themselves may not understand what that scientific principle is.
What's spatiotemporal hyperlink?
What's that?
No idea, just made it up. Don't want to say magic door.
This is actually an example of Clarke's third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Well, what about something like, let's say, Dune? Again, there appears to be stuff that is magical, the weirding way, a lot of the things that that Paul Atreides and his mom can do, they seem like magic, but it's all presented in the context of genetics and training, and it's all based in some kind of real world science, at least in the world that they inhabit. So yes, that would be science fiction as well. Star Trek? Woo! Star Trek plays it loose with the science and the realism. But under our definition, all of that occurs within a framework that they've set up. Even if they make up new laws, new particles, new rules of science, there is a framework that is scientific. Nobody is, waving a magic wand to make things work. It's all based on science, computers, engineering. Even if it doesn't make a lot of sense most of the time, it's still making an attempt to create a world that works off of scientific principles.
Star Trek stinks! Yeah, live long and suck it!
What about H.P. Lovecraft? Ooh, interesting. We have ancient alien gods and things that might be considered magic, but Lovecraft actually made an effort in subsequent works to frame all these things in the context of they are not just these alien gods in the context of they're strange. No, these are literal aliens. They're beings from another planet. These things that appear to be magic, oh, it's just an advanced science. You know, look at something like The Dreams in the Witch House when he pretty much explains all of these things that appear to be magic and spells. It's just advanced science which we cannot comprehend. Again, Clarke's third law. And even those stories that I mentioned earlier about, you know, Martian civilizations and dinosaurs on Venus, those would count too because they were based on the science of the time. Even though these theories and these observations have been discredited, at the time that they were written, they still fulfilled these requirements. So even though we might look at something like John Carter on Mars and look at it like some kind of fantasy adventure, it's still science fiction because it was based on scientific principles as they were understood at the time. So what's not included in the definition? Ooh, that's actually kind of interesting. Under the definition that I just gave you, Star Wars is not science fiction. Even though there are obviously science fiction elements in that, you know, franchise, you know, starships and alien worlds, and, you know, their ships run on hypermatter reactors, they don't run on pixie dust. None of these fantastical elements are actually central to the themes of the plot. You know, nobody's talking about the ethics of, you know, droids or artificial intelligence or exploration and all these different things. These are science fiction elements, but they're not the central focus of the themes. Even though you do need these starships to move the story along, they're not actually central to the themes that the story tries to explore. In a lot of ways, think of it kind of like horror movies. You know, there's a lot of horror movies that are just straight up horror, thriller, gore, and they may have a joke or two here and there just to kind of alleviate tension, things like that, you know, dark humor. But nobody would consider a lot of horror movies to be comedies, even though they have jokes. So in that same respect, something like Star Wars, which has science fiction elements, would not actually be science fiction because those elements are not actually part of what the story is about. Star Wars and a lot of other things like, let's say, Masters of the Universe actually fall under another term, which is science fantasy, which we're going to explore later. But basically, all of these things that they may have science fiction elements, you know, James Bond, Fast and Furious, they have science fiction elements, advanced technology, but they're not actually central to the themes and plot. People aren't reacting to them and trying to grapple with the consequences of these fantastic changes. So this definition then doesn't look at the individual elements within a story, but rather what the story is trying to do. So this will encompass, you know, whether something is hard science fiction based on, I guess, the hard sciences, or soft, whether it's based on things like sociology, psychology, alternate histories, and things like that. So all of that discussion, that big long rant that I just gave right now, all of that was just to figure out what is the genre we're talking about. So next up, we gotta figure out, well then, what was the first science fiction story? And given that definition, it should be easy to figure that out, right? The question of what is the first science fiction story is about as convoluted as you're trying to figure out what is science fiction. So for our next lesson, we're actually going to go over that. What was the first science fiction story and how would we even define that? I'm going to use my definition and try to figure that out as well. But for right now, thank you very much for watching. If you're watching this, well, this first episode is actually going to be free for everybody. So you can see what you get when you subscribe to the channel and actually join in the premium membership. But if you're watching the abbreviated version, hey, you're missing out on a lot of things. You're missing out on a lot of information, even though you're getting, you know, the general idea. So why don't you go ahead and subscribe and get that premium membership to this channel, and you'll get this and other videos later on. So for right now, class dismissed. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you later.